Hello, good afternoon, and welcome. I'm Jim Grant, chair of the Interfaith Scholar Weekend, an annual event celebrating interfaith scholarship and collaboration since 1998. Unable to meet in person this year, we are so pleased that we have a 6-week seminar series, which has given us a new model for deep interfaith dialogue here in the Valley. Now, for the third week of our book study and the fourth week in this entire series, we have three people from the Abrahamic faiths sharing around the chapters of the book that we're studying. Reza Nekumanesh is the executive director of the Islamic Cultural Center of Fresno. Rabbi Rick Weiner is the rabbi leading us at the Temple Beth Israel. And we have Sister Kathleen Drilling, religious educator director at St. Paul Catholic Newman Center here in Fresno. As we speak, we're halfway through our series on the history of racism and redlining in Fresno. We're also 56 years and 1 day removed from Bloody Sunday, when, led by Hosea Williams and John Lewis, 600 peaceful marchers on their way from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, were pummeled and brutalized on the Edmund Pettus Bridge by 200 state troopers on horseback. TV cameras captured the state-sanctioned violence and projected it for the whole country and the world to see. Though they only completed 1 mile of the 54 miles to Montgomery that day, the marchers were badly beaten but not discouraged. And they began again, as Baldwin asks us to do, 25,000 of them arriving in 2 weeks at the Capitol in Montgomery, singing to Governor George Wallace and everyone who would listen, "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around." Now, one thing that the Selma marchers, our opening panel, James Baldwin, Eddie Glaude Jr., and Audra Lord have made clear is this: it's not now, nor has it ever been, the Black person's task to save white Americans, or white Americans' duty to save people of color. On the contrary, we are seeing that our challenge as white people is to release ourselves from our own captivity and from the lies, as Baldwin expresses in the book, that continue to tell ourselves. Interfaith Scholar Weekend is an effort this year to educate ourselves around this overdue racial reckoning and bearing witness personally and as a community. Our contemplative reading of Begin Again isn't just an intellectual, moral, or spiritual exercise, but it means to be transformative, leading us to work for real change and substantial proofs of greater justice and equity here in Fresno and across the country. Yesterday, 56 years after Bloody Sunday, President Biden signed an executive order to, as he say, promote voting access and allow all eligible Americans to participate in our democracy. He called on Congress to pass the For the People Act, making it easier for people to vote, and to restore the Voting Rights Act, now named the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act, after that great man who went from his days in the civil rights movement to serve 17 terms as a congressional representative from Georgia, bearing the scars of March 7th, 1965, until he died July 17, 2020. Inspired and encouraged by John Lewis, may we never be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. Before we begin our interfaith conversation now about how we could possibly do just that, I invite us all to a moment of silence. Our moderator for today is Mariah Cushing. Mariah is from Fresno, California, and currently serving at Fresno Pacific Biblical Seminary as the assistant to the dean and an adjunct in the Biblical and Religious Studies department there. Her research interests include interreligious hermeneutics and comparative theology. And based on a recent publication, I can tell you, Mariah is an amazing student, and we are so glad to have her on our Interfaith Scholar Weekend team this year. She's an active member at Trinity Lutheran Church in Fresno here, where she worked as a youth director for over 7 years. Her interfaith passion started when she was much younger, growing up in a mixed Lutheran and conservative Jewish family. This experience has led her to study and live abroad in Senegal and Ivory Coast in West Africa for many years. Her international nonprofit and government work surrounds the issues of interreligious experience and justice. She is married to her best friend, Jonathan Cushing, and they have one 9-year-old, Connor. Currently, Mariah is finishing her last year of her PhD program in religion and theology at the Distinguished University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. Thank you, Mariah, for all you've done for us and for moderating today's panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for that warm introduction. And welcome to this afternoon's book discussion on Chapter 4, The Reckoning, and Chapter 5, Elsewhere. First, I'd like to introduce Hajj Reza Nekumanesh, the Executive Director of the Islamic Cultural Center of Fresno. Hajj Reza has been serving the Muslim community in Fresno for more than 20 years. He is a strong advocate for social, racial, economic, and environmental justice, and inter- and intra-faith understanding and cooperation. In 2018, Reza was honored the Way of Peace Award from the Fresno Center for Nonviolence for his work to bring about greater justice for all communities in Fresno. In 2019, he was recognized as one of Fresno's unmasked heroes for his work to fight for the underserved, marginalized, and unheard masses of the population. In 2017, his work was highlighted in a national campaign, which is still on display in Washington, D.C., called Facing America, that highlighted the work of those struggling to bring about justice and honor for all immigrant communities. A strong advocate of social justice, he has worked at the local, state, and national levels in fighting for immigration reform, housing justice issues, sanctuary law, reducing police violence, and many other issues. In working to promote the faith of Islam, the work of the interfaith community, and to highlight the struggles of the marginalized, Reza's work and interviews have been featured in over 100 print and television stories, podcasts, and documentaries. Among dozens of others are the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Miami Herald, the Iqama magazine, Islamic Horizons, and the powerful podcast, Prophetic Resistance. He received a certificate in public theology from the American Baptist Seminary of the West and Graduate Theological Union in 2019. He also has a master's in Islamic leadership from Bayan College of Claremont, Lincoln University, 2013, a bachelor's of philosophy and religious studies from California State University, Fresno. His affiliations are vast, but to note a few, he serves as a board member for Faith in the Valley, the chair for the Clergy Caucus, board member on the Mayor's Faith-Based Cabinet, board member for the Human Rights Coalition of the Central Valley, founding board member and secretary for the Central Valley Islamic Council, an executive committee member for Shia Muslim Council of Southern California, and a member of our own Interfaith Scholar Weekend. I'd like to warmly welcome my good colleague and friend, Hajj Reza Nekumanesh. Welcome. Thank you so much, Reza, for joining us for week 4 in the 6-week Interfaith Scholars Weekend webinar series. I'm looking forward to our conversation today, regarding chapters 4 and 5 of Professor Glaude's book. At this time, if it's okay with you, I'd like to introduce our 2 respondents for this afternoon. My first introduction will be for Rabbi Rick Weiner, serves with Temple Beth Israel Fresno, and will speak from a Reformed Jewish faith perspective. Rabbi Rick Weiner was inspired to pursue the rabbinate by the models of the interfaith work his rabbi modeled and the powerful images of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Marching side by side with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Rabbi Weiner chaired the Board of Faith in the Valley, an interfaith organization dedicated to bringing positive change through faithful social justice. He continues to march with and be inspired by partners in the interfaith community throughout the Central Valley and beyond. Rabbi Rick Weiner is affiliated with Temple Beth Israel, Fresno, California, Faith in the Valley, Interfaith Alliance of Central California, and Interfaith Scholars Weekend. Thank you, Rabbi Rick, for joining us. Next, I'd like to introduce Sister Kathleen Drilling, a school sister of Notre Dame, and is the Director of Religious Education at the St. Paul Catholic Newman Center, and will be speaking from the Roman Catholic perspective. Born and raised in the Central Valley, specifically Tulare, California, she attended California State University, Fresno, and in 1967 entered the School Sisters of Notre Dame, the St. Louis province. A product of her times, she was influenced by the 1960s civil rights movement and the Vatican II Council. Education has been her passion as a classroom teacher and administrator for over 50 years. And serving in East Los Angeles, the city of St. Louis, Royal, Missouri, and 35 years in the city of Fresno at the elementary and secondary levels in the Diocese of Fresno has shaped her worldview. Presently, she is the Director of Religious Education at the St. Paul Catholic Newman Center Parish. She has her academic achievements from California State Fresno, Master's in Pastoral Studies and Spirituality from Loyola University, Chicago. Among many, some of Sister Kathleen's affiliations include Interfaith Scholars Weekend as a member, Diocese of Fresno Catholic School Administrator and Educator, School Sister of Notre Dame Shalom and Racial Justice Committee of the Central Pacific Province, SSND Community Racial Justice Committee Summer of Solidarity Education Project as a member. Thank you, Sister Kathleen, for being with us today. Again, thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to Jim and for all of you joining us today. Feel free to use the chat function to share your comments and thoughts and questions. And with that being said, I'd like to virtually hand over the conversation to Reza to open up the discussion and share his thoughts on chapters 4 and 5.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon all of you. I come to you recognizing that I come to you from the land of the Yokuts people who cared for this land long before it was ever colonized. I want to thank the Interfaith Scholar Weekend, the entire committee, for all of the hard work and commitment to interfaith, to scholarship, and to our community for so many years. I want to thank all of our partners and sponsors, and especially Fresno City College for hosting these wonderful panel discussions. Additionally, I want to thank Mariah for the beautiful welcome and introduction and directing our conversation. And finally, just to let you know that I'm honored and I'm proud to be joined by two amazing people, both Rabbi Rick and Sister Kathleen. It's such a difficult task to use the structure of a book to work through your own thoughts, especially if you don't find your own life's parallels within the pages. But we're going to work through chapters 4 and 5 this afternoon, raising up the themes of both, first titled Reckoning, and the second, Elsewhere. As the title of the chapter may highlight for you, Reckoning, chapter 4, is an interesting expose of James Baldwin and Eddie Glaude's call for us as individuals and us as a nation to look inside, to confront honestly and boldly who we are, who we've been, how we've gotten where we are. All of this with a purpose not merely to lament or neutralize us, rather to move forward to build something better. I would like to address some points that I want to get off of my chest, maybe something that many read past. Throughout the book, but particularly in this chapter, Dr. Glaude spends much effort and page space defending James Baldwin against criticism that he received from many Black leaders, mainly and namely Eldridge Cleaver and the Black Panther Party for self-defense, and others within the Black Power movement. He also, throughout the book, places him in the same space intellectually or in some other way with Al-Hajj Malik el-Shabazz, brother Malcolm X, which was quite interesting, especially because though they had been in a few spaces together and there was a base of respect between the two, Baldwin called brother Malcolm his friend, when it came to understanding both identity and responsibility of both white America and Black America, found themselves in debates, not agreements. Of course, some years later, after the martyrdom of Al-Hajj Malik el-Shabazz, Baldwin would find himself closer and closer to the philosophy of brother Malcolm X. But again, this was a strange phenomenon that we find many a times throughout history. People are at odds, even in a respectful manner, but they're at odds with the ideas of the living, only to accept fully or come closer to them after they die. I mean, a great case of point in this is Martin Luther King, who, hated by most in life, garnered great honor and respect in his death, even by so many of those who once hated him. One of the many areas that Glaude touches on, and like Baldwin versus the Black Power movement finds his own difficulties with Black Lives Matter movement, is his trouble and his issue with what he calls identity politics and the need or desire to be seen for all that one is. In the next chapter, Glaude quotes Baldwin as saying that he wants to get past being white or Black or Turkish or Armenian, etc. For someone like me, this is quite a ridiculous concept. And like brother Malcolm's public response to Baldwin's position on this, I, too, Reza, respond to Glaude that I do not want to erase any of myself. I am me with all that comes with it. One other point that had me experiencing some sort of moral pause or dilemma was Baldwin's maybe excuse for white America, even expressing remorse and sadness for oppressors and community as a whole. Both Baldwin and Glaude expressing love and excuse to those who would dehumanize others. While I do believe in love, is not something that I can stand with when it is blind love or love for those that would do one harm. Those ideas didn't sit well with me. But whatever the case, the theme of this chapter, the reckoning, is something that we have to grapple with individually. But we all also have to face it as a nation, as a community. Brother Malcolm X said, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and you pull it out 6, that's not progress. If you pull the knife all the way out, that's not progress. Progress is healing the wounds made by the blow. Reckoning, being honest about who we are, is an important step in the path to healing the countless blows made by history of knives being shoved in our backs. And I do mean being honest about who we are as a nation, as a people. We cannot heal if in the past 4 years we continue saying things like, this is not who we are, or this is not the America that I know, or when I grew up, things were different. These are all positions and comments of people who chose, not necessarily maliciously, but purposefully, to remain blind to the suffering of so many of our fellow citizens and residents in this country. When we saw children locked in filthy cages, and we thought that this is not how we do things, this could only be the understanding of one who is ignorant of our history. If we watch videos or we read of the murders of George Floyd and Eric Garner and Sandra Bland, or Trayvon Martin, or other high-profile murders, and thought to ourselves, this is not the spirit of the country. This is not what we do. It could only be because we are ignoring 400 years of violence against the Black body. That is exactly who we are. So reckoning, truly looking at who we are, is the first real step towards the salvation of this nation. And it can't be color-coded. We can't make excuses. We can't attempt to pass it off as not our sin. We can't. We can't make the progress that Brother Malcolm spoke of until and only until we heal those terrible blows, those terrible violent blows, those terrible economic blows, those terrible cultural blows, and those terrible economic and educational blows. Reckoning. So the organization, one of the organizations that I'm proud to have served on the board for about 6 years, is what came to be Faith in the Valley. And Faith in the Valley is somewhat of a chapter of a national or actually international organization called Faith in Action. Faith in Action has a beautiful platform for change, a beautiful process for understanding our role in creating a better world. It's called the theology of resistance. Simply summarized, but you should all read about it, is that there are 4 steps in the process to bringing about change: encounter, disruption, reimagination, and prophetic action. When I read this chapter, I couldn't help but read it in the light of this structure. Reckoning maybe is something that takes place in both of the first 2 positions, encounter and disruption. Maybe more in disruption, however. When we see something or someone that gives us that sort of moral pause in our thinking, when we hear a story or we meet someone who is suffering, this is that phase of encounter. Disruption is what happens when you realize that you have to pull the weeds. You have to, within yourself, have to experience a moral dilemma. Your heart has to be shaken. And we know that this can only happen when we care, when we love. You have to try to understand realities of those suffering, and that can't sit easy with you. Reimagining, the next phase, is basically looking at the best case scenario, shooting for the stars. What would be an ideal outcome of change for this particular dilemma? And the 4th mode of prophetic action is basically when you have to call out yourself, you have to call out your thinking, you have to call out those around you, you have to call out systems, etc., and work to create this reimagined world where suffering of those that you encountered is removed. Reckoning, again, reckoning. Cloud brings us to a place of community reckoning, where he states at the end of the chapter that our task involves shaking loose the warm, swaddling clothes that secure us in our prejudices and confronting our fears. Our task means speaking truth to power. Speaking truth to power, and all of the movement that comes with it, is prophetic action. Through this prophetic action, it is possible that we maybe begin to heal the blows inflicted on so many communities, but not until we reckon sincerely and openly for who we are, not now, but who we've always been as a society. So I would like to ask each of you, first Sister Kathleen, and then Rabbi Rick, of course, both drawing from your own religious traditions, about your own moments of reckoning, times of reckoning where you were left shook and realized that you had to account for ideas or systems that you've either been complicit in or minimally just beneficiaries of. So first Sister Kathleen and then Rabbi Rick, 3 minutes each, please.
Thank you, Reza. This is an ongoing question for me. My own story of reckoning really started in the 70s and 80s. As the introduction said, I'm kind of a product of that. I was in high school in the 60s and 70s, and in the early 70s, I found myself in an all-white German religious community within the Roman Catholic Church. And that community it's what I felt I was always called to do. And of course, I had this whole idea of religious life, of all these really wonderful, and it is wonderful, holy women, and that together we were going to, conquer the world for Christianity. I did not know some things were going to change rapidly for me. As I watched the political era of the 60s and on. I saw everything, although we did have blackout periods where we weren't watching TV or doing anything else. We were kind of cloistered. What happened though was around 76, I was asked to do a job specifically to promote the community and to work with young women coming into the community. And it was called the Vocation Directress. And at that point, the community decided that we would go to a conference, we meaning myself and one of the 4 African-American sisters that were members of our community, which numbered at the time over 1,000. Out of that number, 4 were African-American. I was excited for this. It was something that I felt I had a passion for, and that it would enrich us and that we could help the young women fulfill their calling. As we were flying to Baltimore, the sister who was accompanying me, her name was Carmen. And I was looking out, it was first trip to the East Coast, and I was looking at all the beautiful green. And as I looked out the window, I knew that we would be staying in a convent, a large convent that was the headquarters for an all African-American, all Black religious community. And I wondered, how did they find that? And what I came to realize was they were turned away from white communities. And so they founded their own, which Carmen told me about. And as I'm looking at the greenery below, the thought goes through my head, I hope the building's clean. That horrified me, that came from my thought process, that it came from me. And then I began to panic. It was a reckoning in me that perhaps I was not as open as I thought I was. And I did not want to embarrass the sister next to me. And so I turned to her and I said, I have to tell you something before we land. And in doing that, I told her what I thought. And she smiled at me and she said, you will be fine. We will do this together. And I said, I think for the first time in my life, I'm probably going to be in the minority. And I welcome that. That set me on a path, a life path to really become aware of who I was, how I participated in racism, in white privilege, and then to be a sister. We were put on pedestals, you know. So that was a real reckoning that started me on a lifelong process. Immediately upon coming back, I received a call from a young woman to come to be interviewed to see what religious life would be like in our community. Taking her through the lunch line, I introduced her to the other sisters, and this dear little old sister that I just dearly loved turned around and looked at me and she said, Kathleen, who's that? And I introduced this young woman and I said, she's interested in entering our community. And this sweet young thing smiled, and sister goes, when did we start letting darkies in? And I knew that the job was bigger than I was, and that I had to do more work, and that I just could not, within and without the community. And so those were the 2 things that set me on my path. Coming to Fresno, I'm teaching, and I walk into San Joaquin Memorial, where Nathan Hensley, who started off this whole process 3-4 weeks ago, was my student. So here we are. But Rabbi Rick, I'd like to ask you to share with us.
Thanks, Sister Kathleen, Hajj, Reza, Mariah, Jim, our hosts at Fresno City, the wonderful work of the Interfaith Scholar Weekend crew, and Staci, so wonderful work interpreting for us. It's an honor to be here, and it's especially auspicious on this day after anniversary of Bloody Sunday, which is such a powerful image in my head. You know, I think back on so many moments throughout life, and just a couple are standing out more to me, especially in my time here in Fresno. While there have been some before then, but I remember a couple things that we used to give one of our buddies, one of our pastor friends, a lot of good-natured, we thought, ribbing about just how long his Sunday services are. Black Baptist Church, really long services, at least from my experience. And finally, at one point, he said, "Do you want to know why our services are so long?" I said, "Yeah, please. Why?" "Well, when our people were slaves, this was the one time that we were free from the whip of the master." Okay, no more ribbing. That was really good and appropriate consciousness raising. Another powerful moment I remember, as we were learning about the horrific Muslim ban by the previous administration, the immediate thought of, what am I willing to do? And knowing that unquestionably, because of my people's history, going to gas chambers and concentration camps, that the way for us to confound that potential registry, they were talking about a registry, is for every single one of us to register as a Muslim. And I knew that we would have to do it if they called for that. And it was just what we needed to do. And then as the pandemic began and we were told to stop congregating, and the young leaders at Fresno State called for a Black Lives Matter march here in our city. We were several weeks in. We were being so extremely careful to stay in and all of that. And I knew that, is this worth risking our health for? Yeah. How can we not? How can we not? It's been ongoing, and I was thinking about the quote that Reza reminded us, that we heard last week as well, about the knife in the back. And how you said that you have to work on the healing, but in my Jewish tradition, there's an additional step to the process of forgiveness. And that is that when given the opportunity to repeat your sin, repeat your mistake that you made before, you don't do it. So yes, you heal, that's part of it, but then you earn your forgiveness, you prove your forgiveness by not making that mistake again. I heard someone last week quote from Deuteronomy, "Justice, justice you shall pursue," which was the verses that I chanted for my Torah reading as a bar mitzvah at age 13 in a voice several octaves higher than I speak now. And I remember learning that it's the word justice is repeated because there is justice that we seek as human beings, and then there is the ideal justice in the divine realm that we may never reach, but we can now not ever let go of. And it is in this that we are driven to work, side by side with our colleagues, side by side with the community, to strive to make right on not a human realm, because that's always inadequate, but to do it on the level that would be divine. I'm going to send it back to Reza for our next section.
I'm just going to make a little announcement to our speakers. If you could pay attention to the chat, I'll be tracking time for you.
Thank you, Mariah. Appreciate it. We're not going to, or else we will struggle. All right, next I want to ask, and maybe we'll have to take a little bit less on this question. First, Rick, and then Sister Kathleen. We're talking about the reckoning of our nation, and you've talked about what you've witnessed and what you're witnessing. How do you see us as a nation accounting for societal sins and the painful past?
I'm first on this one. Is that it? Okay. The real challenge that I keep looking at is, and we heard this over and over with not only the critics of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, but the struggles of James Baldwin and Malcolm X, and all of those were wrestling about and arguing with each other over the bold steps that needed to be taken and the incrementalism of those people who said we're not going to get anywhere unless we take the small steps. And I don't actually know what the right answer is on that, but that is, to me, one of the really difficult struggles, because I think it's extremely important to fix it, to do it, to get it there. And I want to make some steps, knowing that the steps have to be bigger. Sister Kathleen, take it. Unmute.
I'm sorry. I feel the same way. I think there have to be bold steps. I also feel that we can't stop talking. And I see people continue the conversation as a nation. I like what Reza said in the very beginning, you know, yes, this is who we are. And I think people are beginning to wake up. I've heard numerous commentaries on us white folks have to fix ourselves, you know, and not having people of color fix us. I see that happening in our churches. I also see that you get called out for that, for saying that. I primarily work with young people, and we're on Zoom, and they have no safe space. If we were doing it in a building, I could say the things and wouldn't be bothered. But when mom is making the bed behind them on the Zoom, there's a whole different dynamic that goes on there. So I feel for them, but my hope is in the young people, because they state these needs: less division, less racism, help us, to me personally, and we have to keep doing it. So the nation has to we have to take the tiny steps or the big bold steps in our local areas and keep hoping that it spreads beyond. And I think it's catching on. We can't keep doing this. And from a Catholic perspective, I'm so proud of Pope Francis for what he's doing and what he's done the last 3 days, because he's modeling for us big steps.
I'm so appreciative of both of you. I want to bring us back to a point that we, and so many of us, we've encountered pain, encountered suffering, encountered injustice, and it shook us. Once we were shook, we no longer and never again could be the same people that we were before. In many instances, many of us have had our hearts shook. This broader understanding of what afflicts our brothers and sisters in humanity has totally disrupted our sense of self, of community, of being, of belonging. I pray that we all move to a space of reimagining what could be. And I ask you, not as some would ask, to imagine a world where our differences, what makes us us, are glossed over and not seen. But I pray that we imagine and reimagine a society where all of what is we, comes with who we are, and we all belong, where we all have justice, where we're all seen. And this brings us to our next chapter, chapter 5, Elsewhere. Again, so much to unpack. And again, I find myself wrestling with the text so much. I want to honor the work, but more so, I have to honor my convictions. Firstly, the idea of stepping away, of seeking oneself, searching for peace of mind, focus, clarity. This is something we've seen throughout history among those who lead us. Moses left Egypt, Jesus went into the wilderness. And in the Muslim tradition, Prophet Muhammad, prior to his ascendancy to prophethood and his charge as a messenger, also used this practice. For some time before, as Muslims believe, Muhammad received his first revelation from the angel Gabriel, Muhammad used to retreat from the hustle and the noise of his own city, Mecca. He would climb the mountain of light and retreat in a cave. From it, he could look down on the city. It was right on the edge of the city. He had a clear view at the time of the Kaaba, that cubical structure that Muslims believe is the first house of God, who was built by Prophet Abraham and his son Ishmael. It was in this solitude, in this focused meditation, in this peace, that Muhammad was told to rise up and declare justice among his people. He was shaken. He had been disrupted. So the idea of finding time to reimagine one's purpose or understand one's mission is prevalent throughout time. One thing, however, that Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, and so many other leaders of past and present did, one thing that becomes true for all of them is that though they may have spent time in solitude or reflection or removal, after their call, when they were called, after their encounter, after their disruption, stopped removing themselves from the people and lived among the people continually, among the suffering and the injustice and the pain. This is what a prophetic leader does. It is one thing to step away when you're unaware, but once you're aware, once the call for justice grasps you by the soul and by the heart, there's no more room for physically stepping away to confront injustice. One must live amongst it. However, Cloud argues that unlike Baldwin's own escape to Turkey and France and other places, elsewhere does not need to be physical. He even states that the physical elsewhere for many of us is either not possible and probably not preferable. It can be a space of meditation. He calls it a place to breathe. With this concept, am I finding myself more in harmony with? It is this concept that I believe prophetic action is more realizable. Baldwin, in Seeking Peace, said that in America, I was free to battle and never free to rest. And this is a terrible truth for way too many of us in this society. The Black community, the indigenous community, people of color, religious minorities, poor people, all those who have been depressed and marginalized by the system as it was framed and structured, all have never been free to rest. I reimagine a society that allows us to rest, but not until we all can rest. I know we're all about self-care these days, and I don't want to demean it. We need to care for ourselves and our families, but more times often than not, we find folks engaged in self-care in the midst of struggle, some only struggling on a time clock, and many of times using it as an excuse for inaction. Just for a side note, injustice doesn't take time off. But there's this concept in Cloud that Cloud raises, and Baldwin saw himself clearly as he saw himself as a witness. And of course, witness is an important part of the cycle of theology of resistance, but not as a distant reporter. Witness more as one who bears witness and who acts. The Holy Quran, the book for Muslims, the holy book for Muslims, in chapter 4, verse 135 says, "O you who believe, be persistently standing firm in justice, witnesses for God, even if it be against yourselves or your parents or your relatives, whether one is rich or poor, God is more worthy of both." For Muslims, being a witness requires one to stand firm, to establish justice. I don't mean to suggest even for a minute that Baldwin wasn't continually standing for justice. My argument is that removal from oneself from the struggle of their brothers and sisters is not, in my estimation, from a Muslim perspective, the greatest approach to witness. The greatest witness is they who witness from the inside. Even in the midst of the storm, one can find moments of peace, places of safety, moments of prayer or reflection or silence. But after these crucial moments of recentering myself and re-energizing, we have to move forward. And we have to have hope. Just as Baldwin said boldly, hope is invented every day. So I would like to ask both of you, Rick first and then Kathleen, about the importance of space, access to space, the ability to remove oneself from the eye of the storm, to focus and channel our ability to assess and attack injustices. This will be about 2.5 minutes each as time is running out for us.
So when I was reading the passages that Professor Glott was describing of Baldwin removing himself, I went immediately to in Genesis when Abraham is told to, in Hebrew it says lech lecha, which is problematic because you would translate it kind of as go for you, which doesn't make any sense in the English, but in light of a discussion like this, it's like, oh, okay. Go because you need this. Go because it's going to help you. And yes, I do understand and appreciate the concept that you can do it from removing yourself geographically, but you can also do it by finding some kind of refuge. And so as you were describing that, Reza, I think the image in my head was one that I just keep coming back to. Reza was on one arm and Pastor Kreiner was on the other arm, marching through the Capitol Rotunda in Sacramento. Legally, we were allowed to be there, not like some people in Washington, and singing "This Little Light of Mine." And so the refuge can be a geographical removal, or it can be the refuge in the presence of our social justice partners who are all on screen with us right now. Sister Kathleen.
This really resonated with me, this chapter, because there have been many elsewheres in my life. But this year in particular has been an elsewhere with the pandemic and not being able to do what you normally would do. But it also presented me with the time to study. The community had a solidarity summer, and it was put on by the whole community, and over 400 of us took part in that. Where from the University of St. Thomas in the Midwest, and I learned so much out of that. I was invited to be a member of the Shalom Committee. I also then was invited to be a member of this, and just groupings of us began to form conversation circles over Zoom. It became an elsewhere, and it became a community building thing where we went out and everybody kind of checked back with each other on how are we moving forward? Where have you been? Have you been in any kind of demonstrations? And then I see all the people that, despite the pandemic, despite what could happen to them, we're marching, we're out there, we're doing these things. And I see conversations like what we're having now, and conversations like I've experienced, elsewhere. Elsewhere is a state of mind too, and an involvement in going forward. And that can only create a new normal in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. With our next question, Glad touched on two things throughout our reading that need to be raised for our next question. He raised the question first posited by Baldwin as to why we felt the need to create an enemy. This was posed as though the only enemy that we have is truly within. There are no external forces which are in opposition to justice, to equity, to love. Of course, as a Muslim, I do believe that one of the greatest struggles is against my own self, my own ego, my own attachments. But I see it blind to think that I create enemies of others in my own movement for justice. I do believe strongly that there are those that are our enemies, those who, in their own lust for wealth or power or status, are our enemies. And I believe if we do not understand them as such, then our work is flustered, unorganized, and misdirected, which brings me to the next point that will lead to the question. Speaking of enemies, real or created, Glaude speaks a lot about Trumpism and supporters of Trump. Though he writes an entire book about America's flawed relationship with racial justice, seems to suggest, I guess, as some do nowadays, that somehow Trump came along and all of a sudden, poof, he made a bunch of people racist. Quite interesting, because though he was against Trump and called him out as a great problem in the 2016 election, he urged folks not to vote on the other party against him. Whatever the case, he speaks about the supporters of Trump with all that comes with it as some unfolding phenomena. He speaks of the lie in Trump's America, when in fact that lie was persistent as long as we've been in existence. So first Kathleen and then Rick, can you break down for us as a society, as a community, our roles in owning our past and working to move forward in an America where we all belong?
This has been the hardest question for me because it's for me to address, because I choose to stay in the movement. I choose to stay, and I have the most difficult time speaking to those that are so hardened into the Trumpism. I find it difficult to know how to talk and how to be with them in this. I went back and I picked up a poem of Aquinas, and Aquinas is one of the great teachers, of the Christian faith, and he says it in this poem that he wants to love God, and he really wants to love all of God. And God says, I can't show you parts of me. And the poem ends with, please, please, he's begging God to do that. And he said, I have a blemish, and it's minute, but can you kiss this blemish? And he goes, I will try. And he said, this blemish is all the divisions in the world. And that hit me solidly. I have to do that. I have to move towards what I guess you're talking about in the enemies. So
I'm going to just really briefly acknowledge that, I'm learning to understand the privileges that I've grown up under, and I really appreciate and try to respect that we are living on the Native people's land, built up by the toils of the Black people and other people of color, especially out here in the West, where so many vulnerable people completed the railroads and got us out here, to a place that was not devoid of humanity, to a place that was where the natural land was held divine by the Native peoples, a land that we are destroying. So I want to just open my ears and listen to the testimony of those who have gotten us to this point, and open my ears and listen to the comments that I think we had a good question in the chat.
Yes, thank you, Rick. We do have a comment from a viewer, and I'd like to share that with our with Reza and with our respondents. If you could each maybe respond with 1 or 2 sentences, if possible, that would be great. Here's the comment. I don't think small steps are available anymore. I can't not stand to see people of color continue to suffer the same injustices many of us have fought our whole lives. We who are white need to own our privilege and make reparations for harm we allowed and benefited. Until we make it fair, we are the problem. Reza, would you like to start?
Thank you for your comment. 2 sentences. I would like to say that I agree. Small steps are not enough, and we need to be reaching for bounds. We need to be reimagining the world. What do you tell somebody? How long do you expect somebody to wait for justice, to wait for equity? It's not okay to tell somebody that it's going to come. It's going to come. We need to work for it now.
I agree.
I do too.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Hajj Reza, Rabbi Rick, Sister Kathleen, for that insightful, very packed discussion, and for sharing your personal experiences and stories that needed to be told and needed to be heard. Lastly, thank you to our guests for joining us today for our live conversation and sharing your thoughts in the comments. With that, we will have Jim close today's conversation.
You've left me too much time, so what I'm going to do is keep the people that are there on for one of my questions. You all have one more final remark to make. Wrapping up, I still have more time than I need to do little business things. You all get one more chance. Who would like to start? One of the three of you, a thought in conclusion.
Sister Kathleen?
My one thought is that I have to stay in the movement, that I have to focus on the elsewheres that take me to contemplation, that take me to conversation, that take me to accompaniment. And I have to continue to invite people to accompany me.
Rick?
The central prayer in Judaism is called Shema, which means listen. And so my watchword has been listen. I find that I personally, and I try to teach, the best way that many of us can help make this world a better place is starting by listening, opening our eyes and ears to what's around us.
Yeah, I double down both what Sister Kathleen and Rabbi Rick said, and I think if I was going to add anything, I would re-up something that I already shared. You know, it's the Interfaith Scholar Weekend, so I don't feel bad talking about prayer as well. I would ask all of you of faith. God is the most glorious, the most generous, the most loving, the most kind. When you're talking about what you want for your brother, when you're talking about justice, when you're talking about what you want for the world, don't have little asks. Reach for the stars, ask for it all, work for it all, and maybe we can attain it all.
Well, thank you very, very much. I am so glad that you all had one last chance to share a thought that hadn't come out enough or needed to be just coming at the end. I have 6 quick things to say. Thank you, Mariah and Reza and Rabbi Rick and Sister Kathleen, for how you delved into and didn't stay with the book, but you actually commented on and even critiqued the book to appropriate it for your own lives. This is what this task is, to take something, refashion it, and as we said today, reimagine it differently. Secondly, our book study next week continues. It does, and it actually comes to a conclusion on the 15th. Professor Vina Howard will give the leadership role as Reza played today in opening up chapters 6 and 7. She'll be accompanied by Reverend Akiko Miyake Stoner and the Professor Darren Dirksen from Fresno Pacific to share from their Christian and Anabaptist perspectives a different read on that ending of the book. I want to thank you for what you've all brought today, and we look forward to those who will replace you next week. Thirdly, we hope that others will do what Sister Kathleen mentioned. Form your own circles, discuss issues. It doesn't have to be Baldwin and Glaude. It could be anything that becomes a chance to share your faith around these difficult reckoning issues. Fourthly, there's an evaluation, not just at the end of time, but even after these little workshops. Can you look at it when you get it? You're going to get a little reminder of the link to see the show again and then to evaluate it. Thank you very much for doing that. It helps us appreciate what we can do differently. Fifthly, it's a free service we have here with the ISW, but if anyone out of the generosity of their giant hearts would like to contribute to support this effort during the pandemic year when we don't have all the buy-in that we sometimes have, thank you. There's a way to do that at interfaithscholar.org. I thank you for your generosity in advance. And lastly, thanks for joining us today. Everyone who was here live at 4 o'clock on the 8th, or who will see this on the many platforms that it will be available on YouTube and our Facebook at ISW. Thank you. Be back again next week. Take care. Be safe. Have a good week. God bless. Thank you, Reza, Rick, and Kathleen. God bless.